Welcome to a story history nearly buried, but too powerful to ignore. In the turbulent aftermath of 1867, when America was still bleeding from the scars of slavery, a young black girl made a decision that would shock an entire nation. She chose compassion over fear and humanity over hatred when she rescued a dying enslaved giant, an act that challenged everything people believed about race power and mercy in that era. Before me in the cave-in, tell me you are watching from, and if you value deeply researched, true historical stories that take real effort to uncover, make sure to subscribe so you never miss what history tried to hide. In 1867, the United States was technically at peace, but the nation was far from healed. The Civil War had ended just 2 years earlier, leaving cities burned, economies shattered, and millions of lives permanently altered. Slavery was abolished on paper, yet freedom itself was unstable and dangerous for formerly enslaved black Americans. The country stood at a crossroads, unsure whether it would move toward justice or fall back into cruelty under a different name. Reconstruction was underway, but it was fragile and deeply contested. Federal troops occupied southern states, new laws promised citizenship and rights, and formerly enslaved people tried to build lives from nothing. At the same time, violent resistance grew. White supremacist groups emerged, lynchings increased, and local authorities often looked the other way. For many black families, freedom came with hunger, fear, and constant uncertainty rather than safety. Economically, the South was in ruins. Plantations collapsed. Land ownership remained out of reach for most freed people, and exploitative systems like sharecropping replaced outright slavery. These arrangements trapped black families in cycles of debt that felt hauntingly similar to bondage. Children often worked alongside adults, and survival demanded maturity far beyond their years. Socially, America struggled with its conscience. Newspapers debated whether people were truly equal, politicians argued over who deserved protection, and communities were divided by resentment and loss. Former enslavers felt humiliated, while freed people were expected to show gratitude for rights that should never have been denied. This tension created an atmosphere where acts of violence were common, but acts of compassion were rare. It was within this broken, volatile landscape that one small, human decision would stand out against the chaos. In a time when cruelty was normalized and empathy was dangerous, a single act of mercy would challenge the nation's understanding of race and humanity. That is the America of 1867 where this story begins. In post-Civil War America, stories of giants were not uncommon, especially in newspapers hungry for sensation. People used the word loosely to describe men of unusual size, strength, or physical presence. In this case, the enslaved giant was a real person, but his legend grew far beyond the truth. His height and strength were exaggerated, turning him into a symbol of fear rather than a human being struggling to survive. During slavery, physically large enslaved men were often treated as tools instead of people. They were forced into the most brutal labor, punished more harshly, and feared by enslavers who worried about rebellion. Even after emancipation, that fear did not disappear. A large black man was still seen as a threat, especially in a society already paranoid about losing control after slavery ended. Rumors spread quickly in 1867, often fueled by racist imagination rather than facts. Some claimed the giant was violent, others said he had superhuman strength, and a few even suggested he was dangerous by nature. These stories made communities uneasy and gave justification for cruelty. In reality, the man was exhausted, wounded, and near death, far from the monster people imagined. Newspapers and word of mouth turned his suffering into spectacle. Instead of asking how he had been and was dying, or why he was dying, many focused on his size and framed him as something unnatural. This dehumanization made it easier for society to ignore his pain and harder for anyone to step forward with compassion. That is what makes this story so powerful. When the truth stripped away the myth, what remained was not a giant to be feared, but a broken man abandoned by a nation that had promised freedom. And in the middle of that fear-driven narrative, one unexpected act of humanity would completely rewrite how the world saw him. In 1867, being a young black girl in America meant growing up in a world that offered freedom in words, but danger in reality. Although slavery had been abolished, daily life was still shaped by fear, discrimination, and survival. Many black families lived under constant threat from violence, poverty, and laws designed to limit their movement and opportunities. Childhood, as we understand it today, barely existed for black children during this time. Most black girls were expected to work from a very young age. Whether helping their families, laboring in fields, cleaning homes, or caring for younger siblings, responsibility came early. Education was rare and often dangerous to pursue, as schools for black children were targets of intimidation and attacks. Every day required awareness, caution, and emotional strength far beyond their years. Socially, black girls were nearly invisible to the wider society, except through cruel stereotypes. They were denied protection, dismissed as unimportant, and often blamed for circumstances forced upon them. The legal system rarely defended them, and even small mistakes could lead to severe punishment. Silence and obedience were often taught as survival tools. Despite this harsh reality, black girls learned resilience in powerful ways. They absorbed lessons of empathy, community, and moral strength from elders who had endured slavery itself. Kindness was not weakness, it was a form of resistance. Helping others, even at personal risk, was how dignity was preserved in a society determined to strip it away. This is the world that shaped her character. Surrounded by injustice and raised under pressure, she understood suffering intimately. That understanding would guide her actions in a moment when compassion was rare. Fear was dominant, and one simple decision would echo far beyond her own life. The encounter did not happen in a place of safety or comfort. It happened on the margins of society, where suffering was easy to ignore and help rarely came. The girl was going about her daily routine, focused on survival, like so many others, when she noticed something that felt wrong. What she saw stopped her cold and forced a choice no child should ever have to make. Lying there was the man people whispered about, the so-called giant. Stripped of the myths and rumors, he was clearly near death. His body showed signs of exhaustion, injury, and neglect. He was alone, abandoned, and treated as if his life no longer mattered. For most people in 1867, walking away would have been the safer and more expected response. Fear filled the air in that moment. A black girl approaching a large, Injured man could easily be accused of wrongdoing, or worse, punished for interfering. Society had taught her that helping someone like him could bring danger to her own life. Yet something stronger than fear took hold, a quiet sense of responsibility and shared humanity. She did not see a monster or a threat. She saw pain she recognized, suffering she understood all too well. In that instant, the boundaries created by race, size, and public fear dissolved. What remained was a simple truth: someone was dying, and she could not turn away. That moment became the turning point of the entire story. One choice, made without witnesses or applause, would ripple outward and challenge a nation's understanding of courage. History often focuses on battles and laws, but sometimes it is a single encounter that truly changes everything. In 1867, mercy was not something society encouraged, especially across lines of race, fear, and power. The world around her had normalized cruelty as a form of order. Violence went unpunished, suffering was ignored, and helping the wrong person could cost you your life. Choosing mercy in that environment was not just rare, it was dangerous. The girl understood the risks, even if she could not fully name them. Showing compassion to a man labeled as frightening and unwanted went against everything she had been taught for survival. People like him were meant to be avoided, not helped. And people like her were expected to remain invisible, obedient, and silent. Yet mercy, in that moment, became an act of quiet rebellion. She offered help, not because she believed it would change the world, but because it was the right thing to do. There were no guarantees, no protection, and no praise waiting for her. Just a human decision made under unbearable pressure. What makes this choice so powerful is its simplicity. She did not argue politics, challenge laws, or confront authority. She responded to suffering with empathy. In a society obsessed with control and punishment, that empathy itself became revolutionary. That single act of mercy exposed the lie at the heart of cruelty. It showed that strength does not always come from force or fear, but from the courage to care when the world tells you not to. And that choice would soon force others to confront their own humanity. The man was known for his physical power. His size, his muscles, and his ability to endure brutal labor were the reasons he had been feared and exploited for so long. In the public imagination, strength meant dominance, control, and the ability to intimidate others. That belief shaped how people judged him before ever knowing his story. But in that moment, physical strength meant nothing. His body, once used as a weapon of labor, had failed him. He lay helpless, injured, and close to death. The giant everyone feared could no longer protect himself, revealing how fragile physical power truly is when stripped of support and dignity. Standing before him was someone society considered weak, a young black girl with no legal power, no social protection, and no physical advantage. Yet she possessed something far more enduring. Her moral strength allowed her to act when others would not. It took courage to step forward when fear told her to step back. Moral strength does not shout or demand attention. It operates quietly, often unnoticed, and usually without reward. Her decision required emotional bravery, empathy, and the willingness to accept consequences. That kind of strength cannot be measured by size or force, but by conscience. This contrast reshaped the entire narrative. The giant was no longer defined by his body, and the girl was no longer defined by her vulnerability. In that exchange, America was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The strongest person in the story was the one who chose compassion over fear. At first, there were few witnesses, only passing figures who noticed something unusual and chose to stop. When people saw the girl near the fallen man, reactions were mixed and tense. Some froze in disbelief, others felt fear, and a few immediately assumed the worst. In 1867, scenes involving black bodies often drew suspicion before sympathy. Whispers spread quickly through the nearby community. People asked who the man was, why he was there, and what the girl thought she was doing. The label of giant returned almost instantly, bringing old rumors back to life. Fear traveled faster than facts, shaping opinions before the truth could surface. Some onlookers warned her to step away. They feared violence, legal trouble, or retaliation from authorities. Helping him was seen as reckless, even foolish. The community had learned that survival often meant minding your own business, especially when power and race were involved. Yet not everyone turned away. A small number of witnesses felt something shift inside them. Seeing a child show such courage disrupted their assumptions. If she could act with compassion, what excuse did they have for their silence? Her bravery quietly challenged the moral comfort of those watching. That moment marked the beginning of change. The community reaction was not immediate unity, but it was no longer indifference. The scene forced people to look closer, ask questions, and reconsider the story they had accepted. And once people start looking, history rarely stays hidden for long. What began as a quiet, local moment did not stay quiet for long. In 1867, news traveled through word of mouth, church gatherings, and local newspapers hungry for compelling stories. The image of a young black girl helping a dying man known as the giant was unusual enough to capture attention almost immediately. People repeated the story because it challenged expectations and stirred emotion. As the account moved from town to town, details began to shift. Some versions exaggerated the man's size, others focused on the girl's age, and a few twisted the story to fit existing racial narratives. Still, the core truth remained intact. An act of mercy had occurred where cruelty was expected. That contrast made the story hard to ignore. Newspapers played a major role in spreading the story beyond its origin. Editors framed it in ways that would sell papers, sometimes emphasizing fear, sometimes highlighting innocence. Even when distorted, the story forced readers to confront uncomfortable questions about race, humanity, and who was considered worthy of compassion. Public reaction was intense and divided. Some readers praised the girl's courage and questioned the society that had abandoned the man. Others dismissed the story or tried to downplay its meaning, but debate itself was powerful. The rescue became a mirror, reflecting the nation's unresolved guilt and moral confusion after slavery. By the time the story reached a national audience, it was no longer just about two individuals. It had become a symbol. In a country struggling to redefine itself, this single act of humanity sparked conversations that laws and speeches had failed to settle. And once those conversations began, they could not be easily silenced. In 1867, the media was one of the most powerful forces shaping public opinion. Newspapers did more than report events, they framed reality. When this story reached print, Many outlets filtered it through deeply ingrained racial bias. The focus often shifted away from suffering and toward spectacle, turning real people into symbols that fit existing narratives. Rumors quickly grew alongside the headlines. Some claimed the man had been dangerous, others suggested the girl was being manipulated, and a few twisted the story to justify fear rather than compassion. These rumors spread faster than corrections ever could, reinforcing stereotypes that had survived the end of slavery. Racial narratives played a central role in how the story was received. Black men were frequently portrayed as threats, while black women and girls were either erased or infantilized. The idea that a young black girl could act with moral clarity challenged these harmful assumptions, making many uncomfortable. At the same time, a few voices used the story to push back against racism. Abolitionists, leaning writers, and community leaders highlighted the humanity at the heart of the rescue. They argued that if a child could recognize injustice so clearly, then society had no excuse for its cruelty. This clash between truth and distortion revealed the real battle taking place. The story was no longer just about what happened, but about who controlled the narrative. And in that struggle, the rescue exposed how deeply race shaped not only actions, but the stories America chose to believe. After the immediate rescue, many expected the story to end quietly, but the man's fate remained uncertain. Freed from slavery in name, he was still trapped by the realities of poverty, injury, and public fear. Medical care was limited, especially for black men, and survival often depended on the kindness of strangers rather than institutions. As time passed, his legend continued to follow him. Some communities remembered him as a threat, others as a curiosity, and only a few as a victim of a brutal system. This reputation made steady work and stability nearly impossible. Freedom did not erase the scars left by years of exploitation. Physically, his body never fully recovered. The labor that once defined him had broken him down, leaving lasting pain and weakness. Emotionally, the trauma of enslavement and abandonment weighed heavily. He carried the knowledge that society had feared his strength, but ignored his suffering. Yet his life was not defined solely by tragedy. The rescue changed how some people saw him, even if only briefly. It forced moments of reflection and reminded others that he was more than a rumor or a body built for labor. Humanity, once acknowledged, is hard to completely erase. In the end, his long-term fate reflected the larger truth of post-slavery America. Freedom came without support, dignity without protection, and survival without justice. His story stands as a reminder: emancipation was not an ending, but a fragile beginning for millions like him. More than a century later, this story continues to resonate because it speaks to choices that still define our world. Laws have changed, but fear, bias, and indifference have not disappeared. The rescue reminds us that history is shaped not only by governments and wars, but by ordinary people deciding how they treat one another in moments that matter. The young girl's actions challenge modern assumptions about power. She had no authority, no protection, and no voice in society, yet her decision carried lasting impact. In a time when people often wait for institutions to act, her story asks a simple question: what would you do if compassion depended solely on you? The story also forces us to confront how narratives are created. The man was feared because of rumors, stereotypes, and appearances, much like how society still judges people today. This moment exposes how easily humanity is stripped away when fear controls the story. For younger generations, this history offers a different of hero, not one defined by violence or dominance, but by empathy and moral courage. It reminds us that doing the right thing is rarely loud or celebrated in the moment, but it can echo far beyond its time. Ultimately, this story matters because it is unfinished. Every era faces its own version of this moment, where fear and compassion stand in opposition. And just like in 1867, the future depends on which one we choose.